The summer of 1889 clamped down on Dry Willow Junction like a hot iron. This was Wyoming territory, and the wind that blew across the cracked plaza held no moisture, only the grit of the high plains. It was a wind that cured jerky, too fast, and frayed tempers. It scraped the land bare, just as the last winter had scraped the Ellery family bare. Dust, red and fine as milled flour, clung to the splintered wood of the mercantile. It gathered in the rust-pocked barbs of the wire fence where a sign, warped by the sun, hung at a desperate angle. In faded black paint, it read, "Estate Sale." It was a lie. This was not the dignified dispersal of a life well lived. It was a foreclosure, a public picking clean of the bones, and Mara Ellery was the last piece of meat. She sat where her father had told her to sit, on a freight crate bearing the stencil of a Kansas City shipping firm. She was 20 years old, though the sun and the work had tried to age her faster. She was thin, not with the fashionable thinness of the ladies in the mail-order catalogs, but with the wiry resilience of a willow switch, tough and overlooked. Her hair was the color of dried grass, pulled back so tight it made her forehead ache. Her hands, chapped and strong, were clasped in the lap of her gray calico dress, a garment scrubbed so many times the pattern had almost vanished. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose nail in the boardwalk 4 feet ahead, praying it would not draw blood if a horse stepped on it. She focused on the nail because she could not bear the noise. It was the sound of whispers, sharp and dry as the cicadas humming in the heat. That's the eldest daughter, the plain one. A tragedy. What that winter did to their stock. A worse tragedy. Being born with a face like that, too plain to marry, too stubborn to break. Mara felt the words like small, stinging insects. She had been hearing versions of them her whole life. She was the useful one, the one who could mend a harness and set a splint, but never the one to catch a glance at a Sunday social. She was scenery. Today, she was inventory. Mr. Hemlock, the town ledger keeper and the closest thing Dry Willow had to a banker, stood by a table stacked with the remnants of the Ellery homestead, a rusted plowshare, 3 chipped porcelain plates, a box of mismatched tools. Hemlock was a man who sweated lard, his shirt sticking to his round stomach even in the dry heat. He was not looking at the crowd. He was leaning toward Mara's parents. Her father, Ephraim, looked at the ground, his hat held in both hands, a man hollowed out by failure. "Ephraim, the mortgage note was due in April," Hemlock said, his voice a low, persistent whine. "The bank in Cheyenne carried you through the thaw, but they won't carry you into harvest, not with nothing to harvest." Mara's mother, Blythe, stood stiff as starch. She had been pretty once, and she despised anything that reminded her she no longer was. Her gaze flickered from Hemlock's sweating face to the dusty plaza, and then, for a single, devastating second, it landed on Mara. It was not a look of love, or even of pity. It was the look a woman gives a complex math problem she cannot solve, a final column that refuses to add up. Mara was the remainder, the fraction left over. In that instant, Mara knew. The plow was gone. The tools were worthless. She was the only asset left. The crowd had gathered not to bid, but to watch. Misery was the best free theater in the territory. A few young cowhands, flushed with noon whiskey from the saloon, leaned against the assay office. They laughed, one pointing with his chin. "Bet she's mean to saddle," one said, loud enough to carry Mrs. Gable, the town seamstress, who believed style was next to godliness. Shook her head, the dyed feathers on her hat trembling. "Not worth the styling," she murmured to the barber's wife. "You can't fix that foundation." The air thickened. Hemlock cleared his throat, ready to begin the formal humiliation. And then the sound of the crowd shifted. The whispers died. The laughter caught. A horse and rider had entered the plaza from the north road, the one that led up into the high country. The horse was a magnificent creature, an ash-gray charger with the muscle of a bull and the poise of a bishop. It moved through the dust without seeming to raise any. The man on its back sat easy, as if he were part of the saddle. He wore a canvas duster, clean but worn. the color of wet stone. His hat was low, his boots practical. The leather of his saddle and bridle was not decorated with silver conchos, but it was dark with neat's foot oil, meticulously maintained. He was tall, and the silence he brought with him was more powerful than the noise of the crowd. This was Calder Voss. Even in Dry Willow, a town he visited perhaps twice a year, the name meant something. He was the master of the Voss Range, a vast, isolated territory up in the Silvermere Basin. He was a man who dealt in cattle by the thousand and spoke in words by the dozen. He was rich, quiet, and, to the town's frustration, utterly uninterested in their opinions. He guided the gray horse not to the saloon rail, but directly toward the table. The crowd shuffled back, making a path. Calder Voss looked at no one. His gaze passed over the broken tools, over Ephraim's shuffling feet, over Blythe's rigid posture. Then his eyes, the color of a winter sky, settled on Mara. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She did not look up, but she felt the weight of his stare. It was not like the cowhen's leering, nor Mrs. Gable's assessing dismissal. It was consideration. It was the first time a man had looked at her like she was a thing to be solved, not a thing to be dismissed. Calder Voss dismounted in one fluid motion. He did not tie his horse. The gray stood, grounded as a mountain. Hemlock, seeing the wealthiest man in the county, suddenly found his professional smile. "Mr. Voss, an unexpected pleasure. Come for the auction. Not much left, I'm afraid, but—" Calder ignored him. He walked past the ledger keeper to the table. From a pouch on his belt, he retrieved a heavy canvas sack tied with a leather thong. He did not toss it. He placed it on the ledger. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that echoed the finality of a coffin nail. The bag was full enough. He did not ask the price. He did not ask about the mortgage. He turned his head slightly, his gaze resting again on Mara, who was now trembling so hard the crate beneath her seemed to vibrate. He addressed Hemlock, but his eyes were on the girl. He asked one question. His voice was not loud, but it was deep, and it cut through the afternoon heat like a cold chisel striking rock. "Her name." Hemlock blinked, stunned by the breach of protocol. "What the girl?" Calder Voss did not move. His patience was absolute, and more terrifying than any threat. "Her name?" he repeated. "Mara," her father whispered, his voice cracking. "Mara Ellery." Calder nodded once, a short, sharp motion. Hemlock, understanding the transaction that had just occurred, fumbled for his ledger. This was not a bid. It was a purchase. He uncorked his inkwell, dipped his pen, and slammed his official stamp onto the Ellery mortgage page. The sound of the wood block hitting the paper was sharp, brutal. "Sold." Mara's breath hitched. She felt dizzy, the white-hot sun bearing down on her. Calder Voss turned, not to her parents, but to her. He did not offer a hand. He did not smile. He simply regarded her as a fact. "You ride with me." He walked back to his horse, moving with the same unhurried pace. Behind him, he heard Blythe Ellery let out a small, sharp sound, half gasp, half sob of relief. The debt was gone. The problem was erased. Mara stood up. Her legs felt like hollow reeds. She could not feel the ground. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at her father. If she looked at them, the thin thread holding her together would snap. She walked past the table, past the staring, silent crowd, toward the man and the gray horse. He had a wagon, a simple buckboard, tied to the rail nearby. He moved to it, untying the reins. The sun was blinding. It was a hostile, glaring light that exposed every particle of dust, every line of contempt on the faces of the townsfolk, every shred of her humiliation. The women were staring, their mouths open. Calder Voss, taking her what for a servant. A concubine, Mara felt the looks like a physical scouring. Her hand, thin and brown, came up, the wrist trembling as she shielded her face from the glare. Or perhaps from the stairs. She did not care which. She climbed onto the hard wooden seat of the buckboard. The springs groaned. Calder Voss settled himself beside her, his presence solid, silent. He took the reins. The wheels turned, cracking the dry mud. The wagon lurched forward, past the saloon, past the staring cowhands, past the woman who said she was not worth styling. Mara kept her face turned toward the open, empty prairie ahead. The laughter of Dry Willow Junction was already fading, consumed by the creak of the wagon axles and the rhythmic plod of the horses. She closed her eyes. Tight. At least this wagon goes far from the laughter. The wagon road climbed steadily out of the dry, cracked floor of the junction and into the high, sweeping country of the Silvermere Basin. The silence between them was absolute, a heavy, physical thing that sat on the buckboard seat like a third passenger. The only sounds were the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves, the jingle of the harness, and the relentless grind of the iron-rimmed wheels against the gravel. It was a slow, measured noise, like the ticking of a very large, very old clock. Mile after mile, the landscape opened up. The red dust gave way to the silvery green of sagebrush, stretching out to meet the foothills of the granite range. The air grew thinner, cooler. Mara sat stiffly, her hands still clasped in her lap until the knuckles were white. She did not look at the man beside her. She watched the horizon, watched the way the light shifted on the distant peaks. She was acutely aware of him, though he drove with an easy, unconscious grace, the reins held loosely in one gloved hand. He didn't seem to need to look at the horses. They knew the way, and they knew him. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, a chill wind sprang up, whistling through the gaps in the rocks. It had teeth, this wind, sharp and cold, a reminder that even in summer, the high country was unforgiving. Without looking at her, Calder reached behind the seat. He pulled out a heavy wool shawl, dyed a deep, dark blue. He offered it to her. "Basin wind cuts deep," he said. His voice was low, roughened by the dry air. "Put it on." Mara hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was a small kindness, but it felt enormous in the vast emptiness. She took it, her fingers brushing the rough wool. "Thank you," she murmured, the words barely audible over the wind. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and clean air. It was warm. The silence returned, but it felt different now, less like a trap, more like a waiting room. Questions swirled in her mind, loud and demanding. "What am I to you, a servant to scrub your floors, a secret wife to hide away, a living receipt for a debt paid, but the words wouldn't come?" Pride, that last, stubborn scrap of herself that her family hadn't managed to sell off, kept her jaw clenched. She would not ask. She would wait and see. Ahead, a movement broke the stillness. A small herd of pronghorn antelope appeared on a ridge, silhouetted against the purpling sky. They were delicate, fast creatures, skittish as smoke. Most men, Mara knew, would have whooped or reached for a rifle, or at least snapped the reins to hurry past. Calder did none of these things. He gently pulled back on the leather, slowing the team to a walk, then to a stop. He sat, perfectly still, watching them. The antelope paused, their large ears flicking, testing the air. Then, realizing there was no threat, they flowed over the ridge like water, disappearing into the sage. Calder waited until the last white rump had vanished before he clicked his tongue to the horses. They moved on. Mara looked at him then, truly looked at him for the first time since the auction. His profile was etched against the twilight, hard and sharp as the granite peaks. He had stopped for them. He had yielded the right of way to something wild, something free. It was a small thing, but it unsettled her more than his silence. The Voss Range appeared not as a grand statement, but as a part of the land itself. The main house was built of sturdy, weathered timber and local stone, hunkered down against the wind. It was not a palace. It was a shelter. There was a long, low barn, several corrals, and a windmill that turned slowly, its metal vanes creaking a steady rhythm as it pumped water from deep underground. They pulled into the yard as dusk turned to full dark. A few lights glowed warmly from the windows. A woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on a white apron. She was older, with hair the color of steel wool pulled back in a severe bun, but her face was mapped with lines of easy humor. "About time," she called out, her voice carrying well. "Supper's been threatening to dry out for an hour." Calder helped Mara down not with a flourish, but with a steady hand under her elbow to keep her from stumbling in the dark. "Etta May," he said, by way of introduction. "Mara Ellery." Etta May looked Mara up and down. It wasn't the measuring look of the townswomen. It was the practical assessment of a woman deciding how much hot water would be needed for a bath. "Skin and bones," Etta May declared, but her tone was not unkind. "Well, we can fix that. Come on in, girl. The wind will freeze you solid if you stand there." Mara followed her inside. The house was warm, smelling of wood smoke, roasted beef, and something sharp, like sage. It was clean, sparsely furnished but comfortable. There were no frills, no lace doilies, just solid oak furniture and braided rugs. Etta May led her up a narrow staircase to a room on the east side of the house. "Morning sun hits here first," Etta May said, lighting a kerosene lamp on the bedside table. "Helps with waking up." The room was simple, a narrow bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a small chest of drawers. On the nightstand, next to the lamp, lay a small stack of books. They were old, their spines worn soft primers. Mara realized, reading books for children. Etta May saw her looking. "Mr. Voss thought you might want something to pass the quiet evenings," she said. "Not much entertainment out here unless you like watching the grass grow." Mara touched the worn cover of the top book. It was a thoughtful gesture, strangely gentle for a man who looked like he was carved from basin rock. "Is there—" "What are my duties, ma'am?" Mara asked, her voice tight. Etta May paused at the door. "Duties, well, breathing is a good start. Eating is another. We'll figure the rest out later. You rest now. Wash up." She left, closing the door softly. Mara stood in the center of the room. No one had told her to scrub anything. No one had told her to mend anything. She was alone, in a room that was hers, with books someone had thought she might like. She washed her face in the cool water from the pitcher. The dust of dry willow washed away, turning the water red-brown. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The same plain face looked back, but the eyes were different. They were less frightened, more curious. When she came downstairs, Calder was sitting on the wide porch, smoking a thin cheroot. The smoke curled blue in the twilight. He didn't turn when she stepped out, but she knew he heard her. "Supper's at 8, he said. It wasn't an order. It was just information. Mara moved to the railing, gripping the rough wood. The windmill creaked its slow, steady rhythm in the darkness. "Why?" she asked. The word burst out of her before she could stop it. He took a slow pull on the cheroot, then let the smoke drift away on the wind. "Why what? Why me? Why this?" She gestured vaguely to the house, the land, herself. He was silent for a long time. He seemed to be considering the question with the same gravity he had given the antelope. Finally, he turned his head to look at her. In the dim light from the window, his eyes were unreadable pools of shadow. "If you could choose," he asked slowly, "if it was just you doing the choosing, how would you want to live?" Mara was taken aback. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Her wants had never been relevant to the equation of survival. She looked out at the dark shape of the barn, at the endless expanse of stars above them. She thought about the silence, the books, the antelope on the ridge. "Useful," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but steady. "I would want to be useful, and not measured by how I look while I'm doing it." Calder Voss nodded. "Once." He snubbed out the cheroot on the sole of his boot and stood up. He was very tall next to her. "Seems reasonable," he said. He opened the door for her, waiting for her to precede him into the light and warmth of the house. It was a simple courtesy, but to Mara, it felt like the strangest, most confusing thing that had happened all day. He hadn't commanded her. He hadn't defined her. He had just listened. Days at the Voss range fell into a rhythm as steady as the windmills turning. Mara did not wait to be assigned duties. Idleness sat on her like an ill-fitting coat. She found her place in the small, neglected corners of the household. In the kitchen, there was a corner shelf that had become a graveyard for miscellaneous tins and dried-up roots. Mara cleared it. She found bunches of wild herbs hanging in the pantry, dusty and forgotten. She crushed them between her fingers, smelling the faint, sharp ghosts of their scents: chamomile for sleep, sage for cleansing, yarrow for blood-stopping. She organized them into clean glass jars she found in the cellar. With a piece of white chalk, she wrote their names on the slate-gray sides of the jars in her neat, upright script: chamomile, sage, yarrow. It was a small thing, this ordering of chaos, but it anchored her. One evening, while she was grinding dried comfrey for a poultice, she overheard two of the ranch hands, Jeb and a younger, gangly boy named Silas, arguing near the back door. They were holding a brown bottle of horse medicine, squinting at the label in the dim light. "It says 2 spoons, Jeb insisted, sounding unsure. "Looks like 10 to me," Silas retorted, scratching his head. "Or maybe that's just a smudge." Mara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out. May I Jeb, a weathered man who looked like he'd been cured in smoke, handed her the bottle hesitantly. "It says apply liberally twice daily," Mara read aloud, pointing to the words. "Not spoons. It's a liniment to be rubbed in, not swallowed." Silas flushed red to the roots of his straw-colored hair. "Ain't much for reading, ma'am. Never took to it." That night, after supper was cleared, Mara cleared a space at the long kitchen table. She didn't make an announcement. She just sat down with one of the old primers from her room and the bottle of liniment. Silas drifted over first, curiosity overcoming his embarrassment. Then Jeb, L-I-N-I. Mara pointed to each letter with a slender finger, her voice low and patient. "Lynn," he meant. Silas sounded out, his brow furrowed in fierce concentration. Calder Voss had been in his study, going over ledgers, drawn by the low murmur of voices. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, leaning a shoulder against the doorframe. He watched Mara. She wasn't condescending or impatient. She taught with the same quiet efficiency she used to organize her herbs. He saw Silas grin when he finally got the word right. He saw the tight, anxious line of Mara's own shoulders relax just a fraction. A hint of softness touched the corner of Calder's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. It was a rare expression for a face usually set in granite. News from Dry Willow trickled out to the range with the supply wagons. The gossip was ugly. Voss bought himself a plain Jane for a ranch pet. They said in the saloon, "Guess he didn't want a wife who'd talk back." Calder heard it when he went into town for fence wire. He was at the blacksmith's when the smith, a man with more muscle than sense, made a crack about Voss's new livestock. Calder didn't raise his voice. He didn't even stop inspecting the shoe the smith was hammering. He just looked up, his eyes cold and level. "People on my land are free," Calder said. The quietness of his tone was more menacing than a shout. "Best you remember that when you speak of them." The smith swallowed his next joke, suddenly finding his anvil very interesting. Back at the ranch, the reality of the work didn't wait for gossip. A week later, a young Hereford calf got tangled in a coil of loose barbed wire out by the north pasture. By the time they found it, the wire had cut deep into its flank, a jagged, ugly tear. Calder brought the calf into the barn. It was bawling, terrified, its eyes rolling white. "Hold him," Mara said. She didn't ask if she could help. She just was there, her basket of jars and clean rags already in hand. Calder knelt in the straw, wrapping his strong arms around the calf's neck and forelegs, murmuring low, steadying sounds. Mara worked quickly. She cleaned the wound with boiled water that steamed in the cool barn air. The calf thrashed. "Steady," Calder murmured, tightening his grip but not roughing the animal. Mara applied the yarrow poultice she'd made, her hands sure despite the blood. Sweat beaded on her temples, plastering wisps of hair to her skin. She didn't flinch at the gore. She focused on the knitting of flesh. When she was done wrapping the clean linen bandage, she sat back on her heels, wiping her forearm across her forehead. Calder released the calf, which scrambled up and huddled in a corner, shaken but mended. He looked at Mara across the bloodied straw. For a moment, just a heartbeat, their eyes met. It wasn't a look of romance. It was deeper than that. It was the look of two soldiers who had just held a line together. It was recognition. "You are capable," his eyes said. "I see you." Mara felt a flush that had nothing to do with exertion. She quickly looked down, gathering her things. When she went back to the kitchen to wash up, she found a basin of steaming water already waiting on the washstand. Beside it lay a bar of Edemay's good lavender soap, not the harsh lye soap usually kept by the sink. And sitting on the edge of the table were Calder's heavy leather work gloves, dusted with the same straw that was on her skirt. He had been there, seen her coming, and quietly made sure she had what she needed to be clean again. That night, the wind howled around the eaves of the ranch house, a lonely, ferocious sound. But in her east-facing room, Mara lay under the heavy quilt and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the blankets. For the first time in her life, she closed her eyes without worrying if her face was pleasing enough, if her presence was acceptable enough. She had been useful today. She had been seen, not for what she lacked, but for what she could do. And in that quiet, wind-swept dark, she slept without dreaming, a deep, unbroken rest. Trouble in the high basin rarely came as a shout. It usually arrived as a whisper, then a rumor, then a landslide. The whisper began with Osric Hale. Hale was a man who wore two hats in Dry Willow Junction, and both were tight. He was the district treasurer, which gave him access to maps and deeds. And he was the town pawnbroker, which gave him leverage over desperate men. He had a face like a ferret, sharp and always sniffing for advantage, and his eyes were currently fixed on the blue sluice, the deep, cold creek that cut through the heart of the Voss Range. The railroad was surveying a new spur line, and steam engines needed water. Hale intended to be the man who sold it to them, but Calder Voss stood squarely in his way. Hale didn't attack Voss directly. He attacked where the armor was thinnest reputation. He found willing accomplices in Mara's own parents, bitter over their public failure and easily swayed by Hale's coin. Blythe Ellery began to murmur to her neighbors. "It's a scandal, is what it is," she'd say, clutching a new shawl Hale had gifted her. "Buying our poor girl like that. He's just using her as a concubine to get around the inheritance laws. No legitimate heir means no taxes for the territory. You see," the rumor festered. It reached the ears of Reverend Albright, a new arrival to the territory whose piety was directly proportional to the weight of the collection plate. He rode out to the Voss Range one dusty afternoon, his buggy bouncing indignantly over the ruts. He found Calder mending a corral fence. The Reverend cleared his throat, clutching his Bible like a shield. "Mr. Voss, the talk in town is unsavory. I'm here to offer a solution, a quiet marriage ceremony. It would settle the gossip. Of course, the church would expect a standard tithe for such a delicate service. Say, 10% of your next cattle drive." Calder didn't even put down his hammer. He looked at the Reverend, his eyes flat and unamused. "My soul is my own business, Reverend, and my land is not for tithing to stop gossip I didn't start. Good day." The Reverend left in a huff of dust, but the threat hung in the air. That evening, Mara passed Calder's study door. It was ajar. He was bent over his desk, the kerosene lamp casting long shadows. He wasn't counting money. He was drawing. She paused, unseen. He was copying a map of the Silvermere Basin, his large hand moving with surprising delicacy. He was tracing the line of the Blue Sluice Creek, marking feeder springs and old survey markers with meticulous care. He was preparing for a fight, not with guns, but with paper. It was a quiet, relentless kind of warfare that she understood. The attack, when it came, was not on paper. It happened on a moonless night. 3 days later, Mara woke to a sound that didn't belong to the ranch, a sharp crack like dry timber snapping, followed by a frantic whinnying. Then she smelled it. Not just smoke, but the sharp, chemical tang of turpentine. She threw her shawl over her nightdress and ran to the window. The long horse barn was glowing orange against the black sky. "Fire!" she screamed, the word tearing comfortably from her throat as she bolted down the stairs. Calder was already outside, boots unlaced, running toward the inferno. The barn doors were huge and heavy, and flames were licking up the side wall where someone had splashed the accelerant. Inside, the horses were screaming, kicking at their stalls in a panic that shook the ground. "Get the south doors!" Calder roared over the crackle of the flames. He threw himself at the main latch, the scorching heat blistering the paint on the wood instantly. Mara didn't think. She acted. She ran to the water trough, plunged her heavy wool shawl into it, and wrapped the sopping wet fabric around her head and face. She bypassed the south doors and followed Calder into the main aisle. The heat hit her like a physical blow, sucking the air from her lungs. Smoke, thick and oily, roiled near the ceiling. Calder was already at the first stall, throwing his coat over the head of his terrified gray charger, backing it out. "Go outside," he yelled at her. But she ignored him. She ran to the mare in the next stall. The horse was rearing, eyes rolling wild. Mara didn't shrink back. She moved with desperate calm, grabbing the halter, murmuring words that were lost in the roar of the fire. She used the wet edge of her shawl to cover the mare's nose, filtering the smoke. "Come on, girl, come on." She led the mare out, feeling the intense heat searing her bare arms. They burst out into the cool night air, and she slapped the mare's flank to send it running toward the pasture. She turned to go back in. Calder grabbed her shoulder, his face streaked with soot. "Stay out, it's going to catch the hayloft." "The foal," she choked out. "Star's foal is in the back box." Before he could stop her, she ducked under his arm and ran back into the smoke. The air was terrifying now, hot enough to scorch her throat with every breath. She found the box stall. The little foal was huddled in the corner, shaking. Mara grabbed it, wrapping her arms around its neck, pulling it bodily toward the door. Debris rained down from the loft, burning clumps of hay that hissed when they hit the damp earth floor. A burning beam sagged dangerously above them. Calder appeared through the smoke, a looming shadow. He didn't try to take the foal from her. Instead, he braced his shoulder against the sagging beam, groaning with the effort, holding it up just long enough for her to scramble underneath with the colt. They tumbled out into the night just as the roof of the north end collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of sparks into the sky like hellish black snow. They collapsed on the dirt, coughing violently, lungs burning. Mara's whole body shook, adrenaline draining away to leave pure terror. She couldn't stop coughing, retching dry heaves that hurt her ribs. Calder crawled over to her. He didn't hug her. He placed one large, soot-stained hand flat in the center of her back, between her shoulder blades. "Mara, look at me." She raised her streaming eyes to his. His face was grimed black, his eyes fierce and brilliantly blue in the firelight. "Breathe with me. Slow. In." He took a deep, ragged breath, exaggerating the motion of his chest. She tried to copy him, hitching and shuddering. "Out. Again. In." He held her gaze, an anchor in the chaos. Slowly, painfully, her breathing hitched into rhythm with his. The panic receded, leaving only the dull burn of smoke inhalation. They sat there as the ranch hands finally arrived from the bunkhouse, buckets useless against the raging fire. They watched the barn burn. Just as the first gray hint of dawn touched the east, a buggy pulled up. It was Osric Hale. He didn't look surprised to see the fire. He looked concerned in a polished, practiced way. He walked over to where Calder stood, wiping soot from his face with a ruined sleeve. "Terrible tragedy. Voss," Hale said, shaking his head. "Terrible. Lucky no one was hurt. You know, accidents like this. They make a man think about security, about liquidating assets that might be more trouble than they're worth." He let the words hang there, heavy with implication. "Sell me the water rights, and the accidents stop. And of course, Hale continued, his ferret eyes darting to Mara, who sat shivering under a blanket Etta May had brought. It would be a shame if more flammable rumors about your living arrangements were to reach the territorial judge. Might complicate your water claims. Calder looked at Hale. He didn't move toward him. He just stood there, smelling of smoke and burnt timber. "Get off my land, Osric," Calder said. His voice was terrifyingly void of emotion. "Before I decide that you're trespassing." Hale stiffened, gave a curt nod, and retreated to his buggy. The threat had been delivered. The war was open. The fire changed the air. The day after, a metallic stillness hung over the Voss Range. The sky a bruised, unsettling shade of yellow. The smell of wet ash was everywhere, a constant, grim reminder. They had lost the barn, 3 good saddles, and half the winter's store of hay. But the horses, thanks to Mara, were safe, grazing nervously in the home pasture. The fight with Osric Hale had moved from paper to open warfare, and the ranch felt exposed, its heart torn out and left to smolder. On the 3rd day after the fire, Calder announced he was riding up to the Glass Ridge, the northern herd, he said to Etta May over a tense breakfast. "They'll have smelled the smoke. They might drift south, toward Hale's territory. I need to push them back north." Mara looked up from her plate. "That's a 2-day ride. 1 day, if I push," he said. "You haven't slept in 3, she stated. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. He was running on coffee and fury, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and vigilance. "I'll take you," he said abruptly. Etta May looked up, surprised. Calder never took anyone on the high country checks. "I need eyes," he said, cutting off the objection. "And you know how to handle the stock. We'll check the line shack at the ridge and be back by tomorrow night." The ride up was tense. The silence that had once been comfortable was now stretched thin, vibrating with unspoken anxieties. They rode single file. Calder on his gray Charger, which now refused to go near the blackened footprint of the barn, and Mara on a steady-gaited Palomino mare. As they climbed past the timberline, the world changed. The yellow, smoky haze fell away, revealing a sky of impossible, brilliant blue. But the wind was wrong. It was coming from the north, and it was cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of ice. They reached the Glass Ridge by late afternoon. It was a high-exposed saddle of rock that glittered with quartz. From here, they could see for 50 miles, and they could see the weather. A wall of cloud, the color of a fresh bruise, was advancing from the north. It wasn't a gentle roll. It was a churning, boiling mass that devoured the mountains as it came. "Damn," Calder swore, his breath pluming. "That's not a squall, that's a blizzard." He looked at the sky, his calculations swift and grim. "We can't outrun it, not back down the pass. We've got a shelter. The old shepherd's hut is just below this ridge." The first flakes of snow, hard and stinging as pellets of sand, began to fly as they urged their horses down the rocky slope. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The hut was little more than a pile of pine boards and sod, built against the leeward side of a boulder. It was tiny, barely 12 feet square, with a single hide-covered window and a heavy plank door. Inside, it smelled of old pine, dust, and the faint musk of pack rats. There was a rusted pot-bellied stove, a rickety table, and a narrow wooden bunk built into the wall, piled with musty, uninviting blankets. "Get the horses into the lee of the boulder," Calder ordered, his voice already tight against the rising wind. "Use the saddle blankets. They'll have to stand it." By the time they were inside, the world had vanished. The wind screamed, a physical, solid thing that shook the small hut to its foundations. It was not a moan. It was a shriek, the sound of a giant mouth trying to suck the walls apart. Snow drove horizontally, finding every crack in the old wood and blasting through in fine, white powder. It was colder inside than it had been outside. The stove was useless. The chimney was blocked with ice or an old nest. They were trapped. "We wait," Calder said. He stamped the snow from his boots, his face grim. They sat on the floor, their backs against the wall, as far from the drafty door as possible. The darkness inside the hut was almost absolute, broken only by the thin gray light from the hide window. The wind was a constant, deafening roar. Mara shivered, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She was still wearing the clothes she'd ridden in, and the cold was seeping into her bones. Calder was watching her. He didn't speak. He simply stood, unhooked the latch on the bunk, and pulled the pile of dusty blankets onto the floor. He shook them out. A cloud of dust motes exploded into the air. He laid one down as a ground sheet. Then he took the thickest, cleanest-looking one, a heavy wool trapper blanket, and sat down, wrapping it around his own shoulders. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the gloom. He held up one side of the blanket, an invitation. Mara hesitated for only a second. This was not about modesty. This was about survival. She crawled over and sat beside him, sliding under the heavy wool. He pulled the blanket tight, cocooning them both. The space was immediate, shocking. She was pressed against his side, from shoulder to knee. Through the layers of their clothing, his thick duster, her canvas jacket, she could feel the solid, steady warmth of him. It was like leaning against an oak tree that had been in the sun all day. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm try to kill them. Mara was trembling, a deep, bone-rattling shiver she couldn't control. "You're still cold," he stated, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. Before she could answer, he shifted. He pulled his heavy duster off his own shoulders, leaving him in just his thick wool sweater. He draped the coat over her, adding its weight and warmth. Then, in a purely practical move, his arm came around her, pulling her firmly against his chest, tucking her head into the space just under his chin. The contact was stunning. Her face was pressed against the rough, clean wool of his sweater. She could feel the slow, steady thump of his heart beneath her ear. It was the calmest sound in the world, a solid, living rhythm against the chaos of the wind. The shivering began to subside, replaced by a different kind of tremor. They sat like that for an hour, or perhaps 3. Time had dissolved in the white, screaming noise. Calder shifted his hand, the one that was resting on her back. He saw it then. In the faint gray light from the hide window, a dark smudge of soot still staining her wrist, right where the sleeve of her coat had ridden up, a faint red line of a burn she'd missed in the chaos. He reached out, his other hand, calloused and warm, lightly brushing the stain. It was the slightest touch, barely there, but it burned hotter than the fire had. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to speak. The spot was tender, but his touch was not. He didn't pull away. His fingers lingered, tracing the soot. She raised her own hand, the one that wasn't trapped between them. She laid it flat on his chest, right over his heart. She just wanted to feel that steady, solid beat. Thump, thump, reassurance. He went very still. His heart, under her palm, seemed to falter, then kicked into a harder, faster rhythm. He lowered his head. It was not a sudden, claiming act, but a question asked in the last inch of space. She gave the answer by tilting her face up to meet him. The kiss was long and deep and staggeringly warm. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of fiction, but a slow, unfolding realization. It tasted of the cold air on their lips, the faint, clean scent of the pinewood hut, and the sudden, shocking heat of proximity. It was hesitant at first, a mapping of unfamiliar territory, then deepened as the last of their defenses fell. His hand moved from her back to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and she felt herself tremble, not from cold, but from the simple, profound shock of being seen, of being wanted. Her own hands, chapped and rough, fisted in the thick wool of his sweater, holding on as if the storm itself were trying to pull her away. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The wind seemed to have momentarily faded, leaving a ringing silence. Mara leaned her forehead against his chest, her eyes closed. She whispered the fear that had lived with her since Dry Willow. "I'm afraid," she murmured, the words muffled by his sweater. "I'm afraid I was just chosen to stop the loneliness, to fill an empty space." She felt him take a deep breath. His hand came up to tangle in her hair, holding her gently but firmly. He waited until she looked up at him again. His eyes were clear, fiercely intent. "Loneliness is an empty space." "Mara," he said, his voice low and absolute. "You are a person. I didn't choose you to fill a space. I chose you to build a life. There is a difference." She stared at him, letting the words sink in. "To build a life." He kissed her again, softly this time, a kiss of promise, not of passion. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the smudge of soot on her wrist. That night, they did not sleep in the separate, musty bunks. They lay down on the makeshift bed of blankets, fully clothed, wrapped in his duster and the heavy wool trapper. He held her, his body a warm, solid shield against the storm, and she held him back. They talked, they whispered of the fire, of Osric Hale, of the water rights. They spoke of the future, not as a vague hope, but as a thing they would forge together. And in the long, dark hours, with the wind finally beginning to quiet its rage, their whispered promises became a vow stronger than any piece of paper. When the first light came, it was blinding. Mara woke to silence. The wind had stopped. Calder was already awake, watching her. They pushed open the heavy plank door. The world was new, buried under 3 feet of pristine blue-white snow. The sun hit the glass ridge and exploded into a million points of light. They dug out the horses, who were miserable but alive. As they prepared to mount, Calder turned to her. He didn't speak. He just held out his gloved hand. Mara looked at it for a moment, the strong, calloused hand that had held a burning beam, that had touched her face, that had held her steady. She placed her own hand in his, their fingers interlaced. It was an agreement made of shared breath and heartbeats, a pact forged in fire and sealed in ice. Together, they started the long walk down the mountain. The journey back from Glass Ridge was silent, not with distance, but with a new, shared resolve. The battle had shifted, and they were riding straight into its center, Garnet Bluff, the district seat. Calder carried in his saddlebag a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a book of money. It was a book of water. For 14 years, his father had recorded the flow rates of the Blue Sluice every spring thaw, every summer drought. It was proof of prior use, the gold standard of water law in the territory. Mara, meanwhile, had spent the morning before they left on a different kind of hunt. While Calder loaded the wagon, she had slipped into the back room of the town mercantile under the pretense of buying thread. She knew Osric Hale kept his pawn records in a locked cabinet there, but she also knew he was careless with the key when he was busy intimidating customers. She found what she was looking for. Not a grand confession, but a small, damning detail, a receipt for 5 gallons of turpentine, signed by Hale himself, dated the afternoon before the fire. She didn't steal it, that would be a crime. Instead, she used a piece of dressmaker's charcoal and thin paper to make a rubbing of the entry, capturing the date and the unmistakable spiky signature. She sewed the thin, folded paper into the lining of her wool coat, right over her heart. It was her ammunition. Garnet Bluff was bigger than Dry Willow. Its courthouse, a looming brick building that smelled of dust, old paper, and nervous men. The courtroom was packed. Osric Hale had made sure of it. He sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Reverend Albright and a weasel-faced man Mara recognized as a drifter who sometimes worked odd jobs for Hale. The judge, Justice Calloway, was an old man with skin like crinkled parchment and eyes that had seen every lie the territory could invent. He sat high on his bench, looking bored. Hale began his attack not with water law, but with character assassination. "Your Honor," Hale drawled, standing and smoothing his expensive waistcoat. "We are here to discuss the stewardship of vital resources. Stewardship requires moral standing. Can we trust a man who openly flouts the sacred institutions of marriage, who keeps a woman in his home without the sanctity of vows? Reverend Albright nodded piously, clutching his Bible. The drifter smirked, ready to recite whatever lies Hale had paid him for. Calder sat stone still. He did not rise to the bait. He simply laid his hand on the heavy water ledger, but it was Mara who moved first. She stood up. The courtroom murmured. Women did not usually speak here unless spoken to. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, devoid of the tremor she felt inside. "Mr. Hale speaks of stewardship. I would like to call a witness to speak to the stewardship practiced at Voss Range." She gestured to the back of the room. Silas, the young ranch hand, stood up, looking terrified in his clean Sunday shirt. He walked to the front, twisting his hat in his hands. "Silas," Mara said gently, "can you tell the court what this says?" She held up the old primer she had brought. Silas swallowed hard. He looked at the book, then at Mara, finding courage in her steady gaze. He took a deep breath and began to read. It was slow, halting, but clear. The horse is a noble beast. Treat him with kindness, and he will serve you well." The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone knew Silas. Everyone knew he couldn't read a lick. "Mr. Voss provides a home where people grow." "Your Honor," Mara said, turning to the judge, "he values what is useful, not just what is profitable. That is stewardship." Justice Calloway leaned forward, a flicker of interest in his tired eyes. "Proceed, Mr. Voss." Calder stood then. He didn't make a speech. He opened his father's ledger. He laid out the maps he had drawn, the ink smudged in places with sweat and soot. Evidence of his labor. He spoke of flow rates, of cubic feet per second, of 14 years of careful, documented use. It was dull, methodical, and utterly compelling. It was the truth, laid out in numbers. Hale, seeing his moral argument crumbling, grew desperate. He waved a piece of paper. "Sentimental nonsense. I have here a receipt for a generous donation to the church building fund, proving my own commitment to this community's future." It was Mara's moment. She didn't wait for permission. She ripped the seam of her coat lining. The sound of tearing fabric was loud in the quiet room. She pulled out the folded charcoal rubbing. "And I have a receipt too, Mr. Hale," she said, walking toward the bench. She didn't look at Hale. She looked only at the judge. Dated the day before the Voss barn burned down, for 5 gallons of turpentine, an unusual amount for a man who doesn't paint. She handed it up to Justice Calloway. The old judge unfolded it, his eyes narrowing as he compared the signature on Hale's church donation to the spiky script on the charcoal rubbing. Hale turned a mottled shade of purple. "This is absurd, a forgery, I demand." Justice Calloway slammed his gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot. "You will demand nothing in my court, Mr. Hale." The judge snapped. "Sheriff, you will seal Mr. Hale's warehouse immediately. We will adjourn for 2 days while this new evidence is investigated." The gavel banged again. Adjourned. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Hale was shouting at his lawyer. The townsfolk were whispering furiously, eyes darting from Hale's sweating face to Mara's calm one. The tide had turned. Outside on the courthouse steps, the air was cool and clean. Calder didn't immediately lead her to the wagon. He stopped, turning to face her fully in the afternoon sun. He didn't embrace her. That wasn't his way. Not here, not in front of everyone. Instead, he took off his hat, a gesture of profound respect in the territory. He looked at her, really looked at her, with the same intensity he had used when he bought her. But the meaning was entirely different now. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the mountain. Mara met his gaze. She didn't need a grand declaration. In the steady blue of his eyes, she saw everything. She saw the partnership they had built in the snow, the trust they had forged in the fire. "We are not done yet," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, putting his hat back on, shading his eyes. "But we're winning." They walked down the steps together, not as master and servant, but as allies who had just taken the first hill in a long war. The 2 days of the adjournment were the longest of Mara's life. They didn't return to the ranch. They stayed in the small, clean boarding house in Garnet Bluff, waiting for the sheriff's report. The waiting was its own kind of fire, a low, anxious burn. On the second morning, the sheriff, a quiet man named Fates, found Calder at the hotel. "Well, Voss," he said, pushing back his hat. "We found the turpentine, or what was left of it, 10 gallons, matching the description. And we found where that cross had been prized from the Reverend's desk. The wood was splintered. The legal case was sealed. But Calder knew, and Mara knew, that the law was only half the battle. A court could give him his water, but only the town could give Mara back her name. "We're not going back to the ranch," Calder said to her, his jaw set. "We're going to Dry Willow." The bell of the Dry Willow meeting house had not rung for a public summons in over a year. It was a sound reserved for fires, floods, or profound public business. It rang at noon, sharp and insistent, cutting through the midday heat. Calder had requested the public census. It was an old territorial custom, a holdover from before the courts, a place where a man could settle a matter of honor before the assembled populace. They gathered in the same dusty plaza where Mara had been sold. She stood this time, not on a crate, but on the raised porch of the mercantile. Calder stood beside her, his duster clean, his hat pulled low. He was not there as a defendant. He was there as a property owner making a statement. Etta May was there too, sitting on a bench near the door, her hands folded over a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her lap. The crowd was the same, yet different. They were uneasy, their curiosity sharpened by the scent of scandal and the fall of a powerful man. Osric Hale was there, but he was no longer at the center. He stood near the edge, his ferret face pale and sweating. Reverend Albright stood by the meeting-house steps, his head bowed, and then, pushing through the crowd, came Blythe Ellery. Mara's mother looked disheveled. The new shawl Hale had given her was gone. Her hair was escaping its pins, and her eyes held a frantic, desperate anger. The shame of her family's ruin, now compounded by her association with Hale's crimes, had broken her. She stopped at the foot of the porch, staring up at her daughter. She saw Mara, standing tall in a clean dress, her face no longer haunted by shame, but hardened by resolve. And she saw the man standing beside her, Calder Voss, a fortress of quiet power. The bitterness poured out of Blythe, raw and uncontrolled. "Well, look at you," she spat, her voice carrying across the silent plaza. "Aren't we the fine lady now, standing on the porch instead of sitting on the crate?" Mara flinched, the word crate striking her like a physical blow. "I'd think," Blythe continued, her voice rising with a hysterical edge, "that you'd have the decency to be grateful. You were sold, girl, and you were sold well to the richest man in the basin. It's the best thing that ever happened to you, and you stand there like you earned it." A low, sympathetic murmur rippled through some of the women in the crowd. "She has a point. It's a hard world." She landed soft. Mara looked down at her mother. She saw a woman eaten alive by her own vanity, a woman who saw her daughter only as a reflection of her own failures. And in that moment, the last of her fear burned away, leaving only a cold, clear pity. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that the wind itself seemed to stop to listen. "No, Mother," the word hung in the air. "I am not a debt to be paid," Mara said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the women who had pitied her, the men who had mocked her. "I am not a mirror for anyone to see their own beauty in, or their own lack of it. I am not a thing that was sold well." She took a step forward, to the very edge of the porch. "I am a person, and I am done being measured by any of you." A different silence fell, not of pity, but of shock. Mrs. Gable, the seamstress who had once dismissed her, found herself nodding, just once, a sharp, involuntary motion. Osric Hale, seeing his last chance, tried to reclaim the narrative. "A person," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, "or a mistress, a concubine, Bought and kept to deny this territory its rightful taxes. This is a sham. He's using this plain, common woman to steal the water and make a mockery of us all. The crowd shifted, uneasy. The moral accusation, though weakened, still held power. Calder did not shout back. He did not move toward Hale. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his duster and produced a single, folded piece of paper. He held it up. "Mr. Hale's entire plan," Calder said, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the plaza, "was to sell my water to the Union Pacific." He unfolded the paper. "This is a letter. I received it by telegraph wire yesterday in Garnet Bluff. It is from Mr. Silas H. Clark, the survey chief for the railroad." He paused, letting the weight of the name sink in. "He confirms," Calder continued, his eyes locking on Hale, "that the Union Pacific has no interest whatsoever in purchasing water rights that are under legal dispute, and they have even less interest in violating established prior use, which my family has documented for 14 years. Your entire scheme, Hale, was built on a lie. You had nothing to sell. The foundation of Hale's power, his imagined wealth, his connections crumbled to dust in that single moment. He was just a small, cheating pawnbroker. But Etta May knew there was one more piece to play. She stood up, holding the cloth-wrapped bundle. "Mr. Hale," she said, her clear voice drawing all eyes. "You speak of morality and mockery. The sheriff asked me to look through your office in the Mercantile. Your oil shed, specifically. I found this, tucked under a floorboard the fire didn't reach." She unwrapped the cloth. Inside, glinting in the harsh noon sun, was a small, silver cross. It was blackened by soot, and one arm of it was melted, deformed by intense heat. "It's just an old trinket," Hale stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "No," a new voice said. It was Reverend Albright. He stepped forward, his face pale as ash. He looked at the cross as if it were a snake. That's mine," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It was a gift from my last congregation in Ohio. It was on my desk. It was stolen 2 days before the fire." The plaza went dead silent. The connection was instant, absolute, and damning. Hale had been in the Reverend's study, seen the donation ledger, and pocketed the cross. He had gone to his oil shed to retrieve the turpentine, dropped the cross, and then gone to the Voss range to set the fire. The crowd turned. The whispers became a low, animal growl. Several men who had lost property to Hale's predatory loans took a step forward. The Reverend held up his hands, his face a mask of shame. "Wait, please, I have my own confession." He turned, not to Calder, but to the town. "I have sinned. I was a fool. I allowed myself to be blinded by Mr. Hale's promises of donations for the new steeple. I used my pulpit to spread his lies about Mr. Voss and about this good woman." He looked directly at Mara. "I ask for this town's forgiveness, and God's." It was over. Hale was finished, broken. The sheriff stepped forward and put a quiet hand on his arm. Calder stepped forward. He did not look at Hale. He did not look at the Reverend. He looked at the people of Dry Willow Junction. "The law will deal with Osric Hale," he said, his voice a final judgment. "My business today is here." He turned, and in front of the entire town, he held his bare hand out to Mara. "From this day forward," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable promise, "if any person in this town speaks her name with slander or calls her anything other than what she is, they will answer directly to me." Mara looked at his outstretched hand, the same hand that had held her steady in the fire, the same hand that had held her warm in the snow. She placed her hand in his, their fingers interlaced. Mara did not cry. Her spine was straight, her chin high. She felt Calder's hand close around hers, solid and real. Together, they stepped down from the porch. They did not go around the crowd. They walked straight through the middle of it, and the people of Dry Willow parted for them. As they walked toward their wagon, Mara saw the faces that had mocked her. She saw Mrs. Gable, who looked down, ashamed. She saw the young cowhands, who now respectfully removed their hats. She saw the women, who no longer looked at her with pity, but with a new, startled respect. For the first time in her life, she was not the plain one. She was not the debt. She was Mara, and she was walking away, hand in hand with a man who had seen her from the very beginning. The victory in the plaza was a clean, sharp thing, but the land was not impressed. That night, the wind shifted, coming not from the dry north, but heavy and wet from the south, and it began to rain. It was not a normal prairie rain, but a deluge, an unloading of a sky that had held its breath for too long. For 2 days, it pounded the high basin, turning the dust to mud, and the dry arroyos into roaring, brown rivers. The blue sluice, the creek they had fought for in court, turned from a clear, life-giving stream into a brown, churning monster. It swelled, carrying with it the debris of the high country uprooted saplings, broken fence posts, the entire roof of a line shack. The problem was the auxiliary dam, an old earthen barrier built by settlers 20 years prior. It was never meant to hold back this much water. It was groaning, the sound of saturated earth under impossible pressure. If it broke, a wall of water would scour Dry Willow Junction from the map. The alarm bell rang at 3 in the morning on the 3rd day, a frantic, terrified sound in the driving rain. Calder Voss was already pulling on his boots. He didn't just own the water, he was responsible for it. He burst out of the ranch house and found half the men from the town already huddled by the mercantile, their faces pale in the lantern light, staring at the growing lake that had once been the main street. "Sandbags," Calder roared, his voice cutting through the storm. "We reinforced the dam, Jeb. Silas, take a crew to the east bank. We need a spillway. Now get the Sawyers." He was no longer just a rancher. He was the only man there who saw a solution instead of just a disaster. The men, who had weeks before mocked his choice of companion, now looked to him as a general. They ran to follow his orders. Mara watched him go, then turned her gaze up the hill. The Mesa Chapel, a small stone building on the only high ground, was dark. But in the street, women were clutching shawls, children were crying, and the old men were standing, confused, in the rising water. "This way!" Mara shouted, her voice high and clear. "Everyone, grab your blankets. We're going to the chapel, now move!" She didn't wait to see who followed. She ran to the mercantile, grabbed 2 lanterns, lit them, and started up the slick, muddy path. Holding one high, the path became a river of people, a desperate, scrambling line of women, children, and the elderly. She got them inside the small, cold stone building. The wind howled, rattling the single stained glass window. "Etta May," Mara called, finding the older woman already organizing a pile of hymnals. "We need a count. We need to know who is here." While Etta May and Mrs. Gable, who was clutching her hat box as if it were a life preserver, began counting heads and distributing the few blankets they had. Mara stood at the door. She held the second lantern, her eyes straining in the dark, counting the heads that came up the path. A roll call was impossible. She did it by memory, her mind racing through the faces of the town. The baker's wife, yes. The barber and his 2 daughters, yes. Her own mother, huddled in a corner, looking small and terrified. Yes, then a woman, Mrs. Peterson, grabbed her arm, her face a mask of terror. "Tommy, my boy. He wasn't in a bed, he went to see the water." A crack of thunder split the sky, illuminating the scene below. The main street was gone, replaced by a raging torrent. And Mara saw him. The boy, no more than 8, had been washed against the town's main bridge. The bridge itself was submerged, but he was clinging to a thick wooden post that marked its edge, the brown water swirling around his chest, trying to pull him under. He was screaming, but his voice was lost in the roar of the flood. "Jeb!" Mara screamed, seeing the ranch hand running back from the dam with more rope. "Silas, here! The rope!" She didn't explain. She grabbed the coil of heavy lariat. She didn't tie it around her waist. She tied it securely around her chest, under her arms. "Hold this end," she commanded the 2 men. Do not let go. Do not pull unless I signal. Understand?" They nodded, their faces grim. Grabbing the rope. She didn't try to swim. The current would take her in a second. The bridge's main support beam was just under the churning water. Slick with mud, but solid. She got on her hands and knees and began to crawl, hand over hand, out into the torrent. The cold was shocking. A physical blow that stole her breath. The water tore at her, trying to rip her from her hold. The beam was slicker than ice. Below her, the dark water roared. A hungry, living thing. "Hold on! Tommy!" she shouted, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "I am coming! You hold on!" She could feel the bridge vibrating as debris slammed into it. She reached the post. The boy was white-faced, his small hands locked on the wood, his eyes wide with a terror so deep he could no longer make a sound. "Tommy, it's Mara. I have you." Her voice was calm, steady, cutting through his panic. "I'm going to put this rope around you. You have to let go with one hand, just one." He shook his head, unable to move. "You must," she said, her voice firm but kind. She uncoiled the end of the rope from her shoulder. "We're going to fly like a bird, but you have to trust me. Let go. Now." He did it. He released one hand. She worked fast, looping the rope around his small chest, under his arms, pulling the knot tight. She looked back at the shore, a collection of pale, haunted faces in the lantern light. She waved her arm. "The signal." "Pull!" she screamed. "Pull slow." The rope went taut. Mara grabbed the boy, holding him against her chest, wrapping her own body around his as a shield. "Close your eyes," she yelled. The men pulled. They were dragged from the post, scraping over the slick, submerged beam. The cold water dragging them down. Mara held on, her teeth clenched, her arms locked around the child. They hit the mud of the bank, and hands grabbed them, pulling them up onto the solid ground. Misses. Peterson snatched her son, sobbing, wrapping him in her shawl. Mara collapsed, coughing, shivering, soaked to the bone. Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, was the first one to her, wrapping a dry wool blanket around her shoulders. That was brave, child," she whispered, her voice tight with a new, raw respect. Inside the chapel, Etta May had worked a miracle. She had found a stash of beans and dried beef in the church pantry and, using a small iron stove, had a massive pot of soup simmering. The smell of it filled the cold room, a promise of warmth and life. Mara sat shivering, her teeth chattering. Etta May handed her a steaming tin cup of the soup. Mara took it, the heat a blessing against her frozen hands. Then she saw Mrs. Hemlock, the elderly, frail widow of the banker, sitting on the floor, shaking so violently her bones seemed to rattle. Without a word, Mara stood up, walked over, and pushed the hot cup into the old woman's hands. "You need this more," she said. Meanwhile, at the dam, the fight was desperate. The spillway had to be dug by hand, through mud and tangled cottonwood roots. Calder was in the thick of it, his shirt gone, mud to his chest, swinging an axe alongside his men. His hands, softened by weeks of paperwork and drawing maps, were bleeding, raw. "Now," he roared, and the men gave one final heave, breaking the last of the root wall. The water turned. With a sucking groan, a new river tore through the spillway, easing the pressure on the dam. The water level in the street began, almost imperceptibly, to drop. It was slow, but it was working. As the first bleak light of dawn filtered through the rain, the storm began to break. Calder, caked in mud, his chest heaving, his hands raw, walked away from the dam. He didn't go to check his handiwork. He walked straight up the hill to the chapel. He stood in the doorway, a looming, filthy figure. The women and children parted for him. His eyes scanned the room, ignoring everyone else, until they found her. She was sitting by the stove, pale and shivering, but alive. He walked to her. He didn't touch her. He just looked down at her, the relief on his face so profound it was almost painful. "Are you okay?" he managed to say, his voice thick with exhaustion. She just nodded. Later, in the quiet of the emptying chapel, Mara brought out her small tin of yarrow salve. She made him sit. By the dim light of the single lamp, she gently cleaned his hands, picking out splinters of wood, washing away the mud and blood. He watched her face, the intense concentration as she worked, her touch sure and gentle. When she was done, she wrapped his palms in clean linen strips. Her hand lingered on his, her small, capable fingers resting on his raw wrist. He covered her hand with his other, uninjured one. The simple touch was more intimate than any embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the bandage, for the boy, for everything." She looked up, her eyes meeting his. He leaned down, and in the quiet sanctuary, surrounded by the smell of rain and bean soup, he kissed her. It was a soft, brief kiss, tasting of gratitude and the salt of his exhaustion. It was a promise kept. The new day was bright, the air scrubbed clean. The town was a sea of mud, but it was standing. The blue sluice was back in its banks, looking innocent. Mist hung over the wet ground like ribbons. The sheriff rode in from Garnet Bluff just before noon, his horse picking its way through the mud. He carried the official court order. He didn't read it in the courthouse. He read it in the plaza, to the entire town, who were working together to shovel the mud from the boardwalks. "By order of the territorial court," he announced, his voice carrying in the clear air. "Osric Hale, having been found guilty of arson, conspiracy to defraud, and perjury, is hereby sentenced to 10 years hard labor." A quiet, satisfied cheer went up. "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, "all water rights pertaining to the Blue Sluice and the Silvermere Basin are affirmed, in perpetuity, to the Voss Range. Calder Voss, proprietor." Calder nodded, standing on the mercantile steps, his bandaged hands resting on his hips. "One more thing," the sheriff said, looking pointedly at the crowd, and then directly at Mara, who stood beside Calder. "By special notation of Justice Calloway, the court officially commends the actions of Miss Mara Ellery, whose clear testimony exposed this fraud and whose bravery during the flood saved the life of a citizen. Her name and her honor are hereby affirmed in the public record." The town was silent for a beat. Then Mrs. Peterson, Tommy's mother, began to clap, then Silas, then Mrs. Gable. Soon, the entire town was applauding. They were clapping for the woman who had, in 3 days, been legally cleared and personally proven. The respect, finally, was total. The blackened timbers of the burned-out barn were cleared, but Calder did not immediately rebuild it. He chose a different patch of ground, a flat, grassy spot just north of the house, where the steady, rhythmic creak thump of the windmill set the pace of the day. With his own hands, and the help of Jeb and Silas, he built a new structure. It was long and low, made of fresh-cut pine that smelled sharp and clean in the high country air. It had more windows than the barn ever did, big ones that faced south to catch the sun. It was not a house, and it was not a barn. Inside, there were no stalls or haylofts. There were long, sanded pine tables and simple benches. There was a pot-bellied stove in the center for the winter. At one end, Mara hung a large, smooth piece of slate Calder had hauled down from Glass Ridge. She stocked the shelves, not with tack, but with jars of chalk, stacks of old primers, bolts of simple cotton fabric, and spools of thread. On the day it was finished, Calder nailed a sign he had carved himself over the door. It didn't say Voss. It said, "Plain Hands Schoolhouse," and beneath that, in the same careful script, he had added, "Whoever has been overlooked, please enter." It started with just 2 students. Silas, who was determined to read the label on every bottle on the ranch, and Jeb, who sheepishly admitted he'd like to be able to write a letter to his sister in Oregon. Then, 2 of the younger ranch wives came, curious and shy. Then Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, arrived. She did not come to learn to read, but she brought a basket of scrap fabric. "Waste not, want not," she said gruffly, not quite meeting Mara's eyes. "Might as well teach the girls to quilt properly." Mara did more than teach reading or sewing. She taught them what she had learned herself, how to stand with their shoulders back, how to speak their name in a room full of people and not apologize for the space they took up. Your name is your own, she would tell them, her voice low and firm. As she stood by the slate, it is the first thing you own. Say it like you own it. One evening, after the first snow had dusted the basin, Mara sat at the kitchen table. She took out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. She wrote slowly, carefully. It was not a long letter. It was an invitation. She rode into Dry Willow the next day and left it at the Mercantile for her mother. The note did not mention the plaza, the auction, or the flood. It simply said, "Class is Tuesday and Thursday evenings. We are learning to read the newspaper. You are welcome." For a week, there was no answer. Then, on a cold Thursday, as Mara was showing Silas how to sound out a word in the Wyoming Stockman, the door of the schoolhouse opened. A cold gust of wind swirled in, and with it, Blythe Ellery. The room went silent. Mara's mother stood framed in the doorway, looking smaller and older than Mara had ever seen her. Her dress was worn. Her hands raw from scrubbing laundry, the new, hard life she had now that Hale's money was gone. Mara didn't say a word. She just nodded toward an empty spot on the back bench. Blythe's face was a war of pride and desperation. She clutched her thin shawl, her eyes darting to the faces watching her. Then, slowly, she walked in, letting the door close quietly behind her. She sat in the very back, her hands gripping the edge of her worn skirt so hard her knuckles were white. Mara turned back to the slate. "The word," she said, her voice perfectly even, "is irrigation. It starts here." The lesson continued. Calder had gone to Cheyenne for 2 weeks to arrange the spring cattle contracts. When he returned, his wagon was loaded with the usual salt blocks, sacks of flour, new axe heads, but he also carried a large, carefully packed wooden box. He set it up in the main room of the ranch house. It was a box camera, a complex, strange new contraption of polished wood, brass, and dark cloth. "What is it for?" Etta May asked, dusting it suspiciously. "For remembering." Calder said. He waited. He watched. He learned how the glass plates worked, how the chemicals smelled. He waited for the right light. He found it one afternoon in the schoolhouse. Mara was at the slate, explaining a pattern for a winter coat to Mrs. Gable and one of the younger wives. The late sun streamed through the west-facing window, illuminating the chalk dust that hung in the air like fine, golden powder. She was not wearing a fine dress. She wore her simple wool skirt and a white shirtwaist, her hair pulled back. She was not smiling. She was intent, her brow furrowed slightly in concentration, her hand steady, brown, capable, holding the chalk as she drew a long, confident line. "Don't move," he said from the doorway. She looked up, startled, a question in her eyes. He didn't explain. He moved the camera into place, disappeared under the black cloth, and in a flash of bright, silent powder, he caught the image. That evening, he worked in the cellar, turning it into a dark room. When he was finished, he brought the still damp silver print up to the lamp. It was her, not a posed, stiff version, but the truth of her, the focused eyes, the strong line of her jaw, the steady, capable hand. She was not pretty, she was powerful. He looked at the image, this perfect capturing of the woman he saw. Then he looked at her, sitting across the table, reading a book. "I don't ever want to forget this sight," he said quietly, his voice rough. Mara looked up, and her smile was all the answer he needed. He had it framed in simple pine and hung it on the wall of the main room, over the fireplace, where everyone who entered would see it. The town began to change. It was slow, but it was steady as the windmill. They began to send their daughters, young girls, who in another life might have been deemed too plain or too difficult. Now sat on the benches, their voices clear and bright. They learned to read their own names. They learned to add sums. They learned to mend a fence line and read a map. They laughed, loud and free, when they spelled a difficult word correctly. The sound of it carried on the wind, a new music for the basin. Mara did not wait for apologies from the people who had scorned her. Apologies were words, and she was done with words that held no weight. Instead, she rode out. She visited the homes of the women who had whispered in the plaza. She brought them small, useful gifts. To Mrs. Gable, a packet of rare steel needles from Cheyenne. To another, a copy of a primer for her youngest son. She asked for nothing. She offered what she had. Her self-worth was no longer a fragile thing to be granted or taken by others. It was a fact, solid as the granite peaks. And in the face of her quiet confidence, the old shame and gossip simply had no air to breathe. One night, a full moon, round and white as a porcelain plate, flooded the Silvermere Basin with pale light. The snow on the peaks glittered like a diamond collar. Calder brought the horses, saddled. They didn't talk. They mounted and rode out, past the new schoolhouse, past the quiet barn, and up onto the ridge. The basin spread out below them, a sea of silver sage. They rode for an hour, the only sound the soft thud of the hooves on the hard-packed earth and the distant, faithful turning of the windmill. Calder reined in his horse and looked at her. In the moonlight, her face was calm, serene. He reached across the small space between them, and she put her hand in his. They sat there, two quiet figures in a vast, silent landscape, their hearts beating in time with the steady pulse of the land. They had built a life, not from what was beautiful, but from what was real. The wedding did not happen in the church that had once shunned them, nor in the courthouse that had judged them. It happened in the open, under the wide, unbroken sky of the wild rye meadow. It was late spring, a year after Mara had sat on the crate in Dry Willow. The meadow was alive, a sea of green wild rye that rippled like water in the breeze. Mara did not wear silk or imported lace. Her dress was cream-colored cotton, simple and sturdy, made by her own hands, but on the cuffs of the sleeves, Mrs. Gable had embroidered a small, intricate pattern in silver thread, a tiny windmill on one wrist, a sprig of sage on the other. The guests were not the elite of the territory. They were the people of the Plain Hands schoolhouse. There was Silas, wearing a suit that was too tight in the shoulders, beaming with pride because he could now read the wedding vows if asked. There was Jeb, holding his hat respectfully. There were the ranch wives, their children running through the tall grass, weaving crowns of yellow wildflowers. No one whispered. No one asked why she was there. The question had been answered by a year of quiet, relentless dignity. They stood before a simple arch made of peeled willow branches. There was no minister. The district judge, Justice Calloway, had ridden out from Garnet Bluff to perform the civil ceremony, a mark of respect that did not go unnoticed. Calder took her hands. His own were warm, calloused, familiar. He did not recite flowery poetry. He spoke the truth they had lived. "I choose you," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the quiet meadow. "I choose you not because the world is watching, but because I see you when no one else is. I choose you in the fire, and in the flood, and in the quiet days between. I will believe in you, Mara, even on the days you forget to believe in yourself." Mara looked at him, the man who had seen her value when she was just a line in a ledger. "I choose you," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "And in choosing you, I finally choose myself. I am not a remainder. I am whole, and I am yours." When the judge pronounced them man and wife, there was no polite golf clap. There was a cheer that startled the meadow larks from the grass, a loud, joyous sound of a community that had learned to see better. Etta May stepped forward then. She didn't carry a silver tea service or a fine quilt. She carried a simple, leather-bound book, its pages blank. "We talked," Etta May said, her gruff voice thick with emotion. "The students and I, we wanted to give you something useful." She handed the book to Mara. "This is for names. When you find someone out there who has been called too plain, or too poor, or too anything, you write their name in here so we don't forget to help them, so they don't get overlooked again." Mara took the book, her throat tight. It was the greatest gift she could have imagined. Then there was a movement at the edge of the crowd. Mara's parents, Ephraim and Blythe, had been standing back, unsure of their welcome. But now, Blythe stepped forward. She looked terrified, holding a small, crumpled piece of paper. She stopped in front of Mara. She didn't look at the guests. She looked only at her daughter. Her hands were shaking. I wrote it down," Blythe whispered, "so I wouldn't get it wrong." She lifted the paper, squinting at the letters she had painstakingly learned to form in Mara's own classroom. She took a deep breath and read, slowly, sounding out each word. "You are worthy." She lowered the paper, her eyes filling with tears. It was a clumsy, late apology, but it was real. It was work. Mara didn't say anything. She simply stepped forward and hugged her mother. In that embrace, a lifetime of invisible debt, the debt of never being enough, was finally canceled. The party that followed was not a stiff, formal affair. It was a celebration of relief. There was fiddle music, simple food, and laughter that didn't have any sharp edges. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and brilliant orange, Calder took Mara's hand and led her away from the bonfires, to the edge of the ryegrass where the twilight was quiet. The wind was gentle now, just enough to rustle the hem of her dress. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his wife, standing in the light of the dying day. She was beautiful, not despite her plainness, but because of the fierce, brilliant life that shone through it. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. He kissed her then. It was slow and deep, and full of a profound, aching gratitude. It was a kiss that held the memory of smoke and snow, of shared fear and shared victory. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, solid and sure. She rested her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the same rhythm that had calmed her in the blizzard. They stood like that for a long time as the stars began to wheel overhead. Two people who had found their exact center in each other. Later, back at the bonfires, Calder brought out the big box camera. He didn't want a stiff, formal wedding portrait. "Just talk," he said to her, as she stood near the fire with Silas and Etta May, laughing at something Jeb had said. He waited for the moment, the real moment. She threw her head back and laughed, a full, unself-conscious sound of pure joy. He squeezed the bulb. The flash powder flared, bright as lightning. The resulting photograph was not perfect. It was a little blurry from her movement, but it was alive. He hung it in the main room of the ranch house, right next to the picture of her teaching at the slate. They were two halves of the same promise, the work, and the joy that came from it. Years later, the story of the Plain Hands schoolhouse was still told in the basin. It remained open, its lamps burning bright 3 nights a week, a beacon in the vast darkness of the high plains. Through its open windows, you could hear the sound of people learning to read, their voices mixing with the steady creak thump of the windmill. It was a good sound, the sound of a place where there was enough room for every face to be seen, to be known, and to be chosen forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and I would love to know where you are listening from today. So please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with others. And if you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.